Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming to our session on digging deeper into the ethical use of learning analytics. We find this topic very important and we wanted to start discussion around it, and that's why we invited three amazing speakers today to join us in continuing discussion we started in Teams. And I hope you had the chance to read the paper that Linda will introduce in more details later. But just to get us started, today we have Ben Hicks, Ruth Marshall, and Simon Buckingham-Shum who will share their insights on this topic with us. I didn't have a chance to work a whole lot with Ben, and looking forward to hearing more about his work. But Ben is the lead Learning Analytics lead at the retention team at Charles Sturt University. And I have to say that I read some impressive work on student engagement from Ben and his team. On the other hand, I know Ruth and much better, and we are working on a collaboration that actually focuses on building privacy-driven learning analytics, where we actually try to develop a suite of learning analytics algorithms that are driven by student privacy. And it's really impressive to see Ruth every week how she drives this research and how she manages to connect people from different areas, such as team from Data 61 and a learning analytics team here at UniSA. And I have to say that we made a minor mistake when we sent the email out, and we said Simon has a career-long fascination and so on, instead of Simon Buckingham-Shum. But to be honest, when we talk in this context, in the context of learning analytics, and we say Simon, people usually ask, do you mean Simon Knight or Simon Buckingham-Shum? So we didn't make such a big mistake, right? And I guess everyone here would be familiar with Simon's work, and what else to say except that Simon is definitely one of the people who made all this work visible, and one of the first learning analytics researchers in the field, and someone who was among the first people in Australia to tackle learning analytics problems. So thank you all three of you for joining us today, and Linda, maybe you can take over from here.
Absolutely. Now, I hope you can hear me because I am having a bit of a connection issue here, but Shoko, can you hear what I'm saying? Yep, excellent, thank you. Great, I always seem to have this problem with Collaborate Ultra for some reason, but hey, let's just move on. All right, so thank you so much for joining us today. As Shoko mentioned there, this is a panel discussion, so we're really excited to have these three experts in the field to come and talk to us about what, as Shoko said, we find is a really important topic. When we do talk about the ethics of learning analytics or the ethical use of learning analytics, it's definitely something that sort of just steamrolls into a bigger discussion. Everybody seems to be really excited about the kinds of conversations that we can have in this space. So I'm really happy for us to be able to sort of present what the Learning Analytics SIG for ASCILITE has termed a little bit of a series. So we did share a paper, and I'll just quickly run through that in a moment. We did share a paper that was written in 2019, if I remember correctly, and I do know that Simon was one of the authors on that paper as well. And this was really to sort of kick off a little bit more of a discussion in Australian higher ed around what we need to think about in terms of learning analytics and ethics. But in our series, we have had that paper sort of out there for a few weeks, and a little bit of conversation going on in our Microsoft team. And I do recognise there's a couple of people who contributed to that conversation here joining us today. So it'd be great to hear your perspectives going forward on what we discussed today as well. We're going to be having this panel where we just want to open up some different perspectives, new ideas around the ethical use of learning analytics. And we're hoping that there'll be something that might come from this panel that we can inspire us to create something beyond this. So we'd like this to be a conversation that continues beyond just today's session, which we could run a workshop around. So there's a lot of conversation had about learning analytics and ethics over the years, and there's been lots of different activities. And it would be really great to be able to build on that and also to contribute and perhaps progress the conversation even that little bit further in this Australasian context, and to anybody who is either joining us from or watching this from on the recording beyond the Australasian area as well. So very quickly, and I'm still getting my connection issue coming up here, so again I hope you can still all see this, but the paper that we shared at the beginning to kind of kick off this conversation is a discussion paper, as I said, written in 2019. It was developed by a number of different academics and other staff around Australian higher ed. So we had people from, I think, almost every state or territory involved. And it really came out of, I believe, and Simon may correct me if I'm wrong here, but I believe it came out of a conversation that happened at a pub, as all good research and academic articles do, where, you know, there were a lot of people sitting around sort of saying there are lots of people doing pockets of research on the ethical use of learning analytics. And there's some great research happening in the international context, a lot of really great stuff coming out of the UK, Europe, the US in particular. But there wasn't at that time an awful lot of guidance for Australian higher education institutions. So I think that was really the flavour of this particular discussion paper, was to say to all the different stakeholders in institutions, so not just teaching staff, but, you know, senior management, to our learning analytics specialists, to our students and student societies and union groups and all of those different players in this field, what is sort of the basis of the ethics of learning analytics, and what do we need to consider as institutions or as students or as teachers within that context? So again, I mean, it's a long document, but it's not too long. I guess it's got lots of interesting sort of discussion at the beginning, some principles that we outline, and then a discussion of some of those broader issues that are coming forward. Things like, you know, the rise of artificial intelligence and what that means for the ethics of learning analytics as well. But I just wanted to very briefly mention some of the key principles, just in case for those of you who haven't looked at this document yet. We did want to focus on privacy, but we do recognise that privacy as an ethical construct is the one that everybody sort of gravitates to, because I guess in some ways it's the clearest, or it's the one we seem to have the most legislation around, so it does become this slightly easier thing to discuss in this space. So a lot of work in learning analytics ethics has actually focused very much predominantly on privacy, but we felt that it needed to go beyond privacy. So things around data ownership and control, transparency of data, who can see it, and knowing who can see what data, consent, especially from the student perspective. How do we get students' consent? That bigger debate about opting in or opting out of these sorts of data collection activities. Anonymity in this space as well. The idea that we don't want to do horrible things to each other, basically. So, you know, the idea of beneficence and non-maleficence there. I had to practice how to say those for hours. Data management and security. And of course, access to the data, which if there is no access, you know, obviously a lot of these conversations are a little pointless. So these are some of the key things that this particular paper dealt with. And so the sort of limited discussion that happened in our Microsoft Teams site, we were asking people to look at these sorts of ideas, but from a few different perspectives of what they did as themselves, what they did or what their institution did, and then some of the broader considerations around these sorts of ideas. So it was great to get a little bit of discussion going there, but we'd like to carry that on today. So what I'll do now is I will stop sharing my screen, and so that hopefully means you'll be able to see more of us who are involved in this conversation. And I'd really like to just go around each of our panelists. So Shoko's done a lovely introduction to each of them now, but each of these panelists represent sort of a different perspective on the ethical use of learning analytics. So Ruth very much comes from that industry or vendor-based sort of perspective, but obviously having a lot of emphasis on this particular idea of ethical use of data in an education context. Ben is very much at the coalface and sort of there as a learning analytics specialist and dealing with data on a day-to-day basis. And Simon is omnipresent in the whole learning analytics, I guess you could say. He sort of has many, many different hats on, but certainly has a little bit of an idea of what this looks like from an institutional perspective, but also from a research perspective. So, and that strategic idea within the institution. So I think if it's okay, I'll pass over to Ruth to kick us off. So Ruth, would you just like to give us a little bit of an introduction to your perspective on the ethical use of learning analytics in higher ed?
Yes, thank you very much. That's quite a big question, and I've got quite a broad perspective on it, but maybe I'll talk about what I'm actually actively working on, which Srečko touched on earlier on. So as you rightly say, privacy is probably the most commonly considered sort of aspect of ethical AI and analytics in general, and certainly one that's takes up most of my focus when it comes to thinking about ethics and the work that I do. And that's also because obviously I'm the director of R&D in an education technology company, and therefore I'm the one that's driving all the data-driven components of our company. And data privacy, to me, has to be the starting point, not the afterthought of that. So as we're setting up the infrastructure and the architecture to do analytics as well as learning analytics, we're thinking about privacy from that perspective immediately. But it's more than just how you handle personal information, and it's more than just how you handle the original data that is generated by the end user, the student. It's also about what you learn about that student when you do analytics, or run models and what have you over the data that they're producing, and then how you address those. So the work that we're doing, for example, with the University of South Australia, is looking at various different ways that we can, and this again does not set us by any ways alone. We and every other EdTech are looking at ways that we can anticipate problems, performance problems, or engagement issues, and what have you, with our students, so that we can intervene early and get better outcomes for them, better engagement levels, and what have you. But we have to really be careful about what that means. I always think of the Minority Report when I start getting too stuck into that, the movie where you're sending people to prison before they've actually committed the crime, and so that's an aspect that's also extremely front of mind when we're doing this work. Do we intervene directly to the student as well? Because then there's questions about whether you're negatively affecting their agency in the whole process, or do you surface issues to the coordinators or the instructors, and then Minority Report territory. So there's a sort of a gotcha behind nearly every action that you take as the learning you do. So that's an important aspect of it too. So I'd really love to talk about what we're doing on the privacy side as we go through, but I'll leave it there for now.
Lovely, thank you, Ruth. That's been a really good introduction there. Yes, and we will have time to come back to that as well. What I should have said actually before I through to you, Ruth, is that for those of you who have joined us as participants in today's panel, we're really keen to get your input and your questions for the panel members as well. So as they're giving their short introductions, if there's anything that triggers that you'd like to ask a question about, we encourage you to put that in the chat, and then we'll be able to try and incorporate those questions into the panel as we go through. So please do throw any comments and questions into the chat as we go through. Lovely, thank you, Ruth. I'll pass over to you, Ben. Do you want to give us a bit of an idea of what you deal with on a day-to-day basis in terms of the ethical use of data for learning analytics?
Yeah, absolutely. It's probably worth noting that my background originally was a teacher, and I sort of fell into this as almost a hobby as a high school teacher. So my kind of my first thought is from the learner's perspective, and then it sort of expands to looking at the teacher, and then eventually reluctantly I look at the whole system that this education thing is involved in. But that sort of really taints my view of the ethics as being for the learner first. And what I'm fortunate enough to work with at the moment is our little small team that works with student retention at CSU is very much oriented towards that as well, in terms of, okay, we're doing this program where we're trying to look at the learning analytics and the different components of the university and support students in whatever way is best for them to make decisions about continuing in a subject or seeking support and things like that. And so for me, when we're talking about the ethical use of learning analytics, that key word is use. What do we want to do with what we've found out? There's the understanding side of it, but when we've found out something, what's that imperative then to sort of act or intervene on our newfound knowledge? And I know that in terms of like looking at the ecosystem of what data is collected, that's really fascinating because I have my fingers in a few pies to try and work out what's going on. It's fascinating that we are collecting a lot, and anytime it's something that is, let's say, non-passive, like we are actively asking students things, from the learner's perspective, they feel like they've told us something. And then if we are not acting on what they've told me, for me as a sort of my teacher's hat on, I just think, okay, well, what's that experience like? And I feel like that's one thing that's kind of a little bit of a concern in how we run things. And the other one that I think I really liked in the paper was the bit about consent, and in particular informed consent. And from spending a lot of time with high school students over the last sort of 10 years, this idea that we have digital natives is a very, very misleading one. We have very, very consummate digital consumers, but in terms of understanding what is happening to their data and what digital footprints they are leaving all over the place, I would say we are possibly in a better situation in sort of my generation and older, because we sort of have this historical knowledge of, saving files. It's the disk icon that looks like a disk. Oh, what's a disk? There's all this background knowledge that we have, that we assume that these consummate young digital natives have, that I think is sort of making that issue of informed consent a really, really tricky one. Okay. Thank you.
Great. No, that's, well, obviously you've hit on a topic close to my heart, Ben, because my PhD was on digital natives. So yeah, totally agree with everything you just said there. But no, you're absolutely right. I mean, there was a study done between the University of New England and the University of Melbourne a few years ago, where when they went out to students and spoke to them directly, expecting them to understand a lot more about the kind of data that their institutions were collecting about them, there was actually quite a low level of awareness, not necessarily of what was being collected per se, but just what was being generated, what actually would come out of a learning management system. Or, they were able to say, oh, I know that you're collecting what books I borrow from the library, but I didn't realize you could tell when I logged into the LMS. So that was quite surprising, I guess, to some, but maybe not to others. Yeah, no, really good point there. Lovely. Thank you, Ben. Great. And just a reminder to anyone, just as I said before, if there are any questions that pop up as any of our panel members are speaking, please do just put those into the chat. So what we'll do is we'll throw to Simon, who has that sort of broad institutional and or research perspective. We'll give you, as many minutes as you need, Simon, but just to share some of your perspectives on this particular area.
Great. Thanks, Linda, and thanks everybody for pulling this together. Good to be able to have this conversation. Right, well, my context is that, I'm both a professor, doing academic research, but also the director of a center that is charged by UTS to use data and analytics to advance its mission. And we obviously have specific expertise around education and data and learning processes. So I have the privilege of, operating at quite a high level strategically with the ability to deploy technology across the university once we've proven that it's trustworthy. Now, so that's where I'd like to start the whole concept with trust, really, because for me, that's what it all comes down to ultimately. But the question isn't, how do we get people to trust our learning analytics? I think the first question is, well, how do we make the learning analytics trustworthy? Because people trust all sorts of things they shouldn't, right? So the first question is really about the integrity of the system. That's another word I use, integrity, because integrity for me summarizes most of the other concepts like, transparency and intelligibility and explainability and bias and so forth. Integrity, not just of a piece of software, integrity of a piece of software deployed by suitably skilled or trained educators, because you can give somebody a very cool tool which they can then abuse and use very badly. Integrity, in the sense that if somebody says, who says this tool is behaving appropriately, making appropriate recommendations, giving appropriate feedback, then there have to be suitable answers for that person. And so we're talking there about intelligibility or explainability, but that's always in the eye of the beholder, right? A student or a parent, in the case of kids, is going to need a very different answer to questions about trust than an educator who will need very different answers from an educational data scientist employed by the university who is vetting a product in a procurement process. So the responses that companies or providers of any sort can give to these questions is absolutely critical, and it should just become completely unacceptable to wave your hands, sprinkle snake oil, and say, read our glossy brochure. You know, the universities have to raise their game to ask really quite probing questions of vendors or open source consortia or whoever it is that's promoting a system, and get sensible answers back. That falls to us to raise the literacy of our own procurement processes, etc. So that's a sort of comment about intelligibility. You know, it's an ethical issue if we deploy a tool with no robust evidence that it actually improves teaching and learning. I mean, that's just simply not acceptable. It shouldn't be acceptable. That's why we do have a whole research field trying to understand what does it mean to make a claim that something is valid and useful. And there are many answers to that kind of question. You know, that's why I'm very interested in challenges such as how we involve different stakeholders in the design process. So I actually come from psychology, ergonomics, human-computer interaction, not computer science or data science or any of the more technical subjects. So I come from a human-centered design approach, and that's something that I'm really interested in, which is that people will trust systems in part because they've had the chance to shape them and understand how they work, and creating design processes that involve students and educators is one of the challenges that we have. And then, I don't know, I mean, one final comment just for kicking off is, you know, what we are doing in our center, I mean, we are interested in Canvas analytics and generic analytics that just give you some checkpoints of, you know, are students engaged or not at some relatively sort of click level. But most of our energy has been going into inventing learning analytics for 21st century skills, or whatever you want to call those things, which are not, there generally aren't products out there that do that very well yet. So we are actually inventing products with a small p so far that we deploy. And with a given product, there are always ethical questions around the specificities of that particular product. You know, what does it mean to design a tool that gives automated feedback on your writing? That's going to raise a whole bunch of particular questions to do with language and NLP, and how you provide feedback on writing, which is going to be completely different from a tool like OnTask, which is, you know, providing automated feedback of a different sort. But so each of these tools comes with their own little universe of ethical questions and answers. So I think we need to talk about specific tools as well in order to kind of really get down to the nitty-gritty of how we design these things well. All right, I'll stop there for the moment.
Absolutely. No, that's wonderful, Simon. And yeah, I'm just thinking of the context that my role sits in at the moment, where we are trying to evaluate the kinds of technologies that the institution chooses to invest in. And some of these are homegrown things that have emerged from different needs of teaching staff, and others are very famous vendor-based products. And yeah, and I guess that's one of the biggest parts of that's probably missing in our process is this sort of ethical and data informed way of looking at that as part of that process. So it's definitely something I'm taking notes for later on. That's really great. I think, I mean, each of you have raised some interesting perspectives there, and I think I'd really like to explore a little bit more about what Simon's saying, perhaps with Ruth giving her perspective. But I did want to come back to Ruth just first, because Ruth, you said that there was a bit more you could say there about the way you think about privacy in your context, and maybe picking up on Simon's point there about talking about specific products. What does that look like for you in your industry context there.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so pretty much everything I've heard so far, I absolutely agree with. And I think, you know, I agree there does have to be a standard. There has to be a raising of, just before I get to there, a raising of the expectations of the consumer community of the products that are being developed on behalf of the students. I absolutely agree with that. And there are a few, you know, those organizations, and I include us hopefully in that do take that very seriously. You know, it can only be for our good as well, because we're certainly, you know, highly considering every time we are thinking about some AI-driven piece to our product, or simply new feature, we consider the end user and bring them in when we can to help us with that design. So the other piece of that as well, because we're also very focused on 21st century skills, we're an experiential learning platform, so we're very focused on those sorts of soft skill developments, developing those soft skills that you learn best experientially. And we've done some work with UniSA, for example, around, and we're still doing collaboration skills and how people work together as a team, and understanding the various different ways in which people engage around a task as a team, and how that influences or maybe affects or is predictive of a specific outcome. And that, so there's two pieces about very product specific. Yes, you have to then think about what you're trying to achieve in that particular scenario, which is very team specific, but also from a privacy perspective, you need to think about, okay, what are the sort of additional things from a privacy perspective that you need to think about when you're actually looking at collective actions of a group. And that can include anything from informed consent. You might have, not everyone in the team has actually given their informed consent to have work done of this kind, and then how is that going to affect the kind of analysis you do? What kind of infrastructure and technology and planning do you have to do to be able to cater for that kind of thing when you're looking at teams? Versus, you know, that's not going to be necessarily an issue when you're looking at individual journeys. So there's always very specific things that you need to look at depending on the analytics that you're doing and the outcome that you're trying to achieve. So I can't remember where the question was going with that, but oh yeah, some privacy. So from a privacy perspective, there's several things. And this is a CRC project that we started about 1.5 years ago now with University of South Australia and Data 61 and a few other organisations, Navitas as well, trying to really come up with a sort of methodology or a set of framework, if you like, operational framework for privacy in learning analytics, and also the tools that go with it. And there's several components to that. So one of them is in terms of just from a data perspective, being able to measure privacy risk, right? What's the risk of re-identification of somebody from a data set, assuming you've already removed the personal information, so you haven't got people's phone numbers in there or anything, and email addresses. I think that's about as good as most people will get, and the level of sophistication exists out there, even within the data science community, right? Even within the security community, around re-identifiability of data, for example, when you've removed personal information, is really limited. So a large amount of what we want to do is provide some tool sets that enable people to measure that, and then include those measures. For example, we're incorporating them all into a re-identification risk measure into all our dashboarding. And it's a way of not only being able to tangibly see what sort of level of risk there are and managing what you do with that data accordingly, but also then raising the rest of our organization's consciousness around data privacy. Every report you see, every graph you look at, there's data under there, there's real people under there, and you are going to see a little privacy risk measure right next to that visual that is going to remind you of that every time. Then you'll have color coding and what have you And then you'll think twice about forwarding it by email, hopefully, and all the things that you really shouldn't be doing that everybody does, because it's quicker than going back to the original system or filling out a request or whatever it is. So there's a large amount around raising consciousness and raising people's level of sophistication with some easy to use, not world shattering, but easy to use, approachable tool sets and measures. And then there's being able to do more sophisticated de-identification, creating synthetic data sets that are differentially private, or doing some more sophisticated perturbing of the data if you are sharing them for research purposes, which we do a lot, right? Because that's really, as I said, going back to the fit for purpose and the scope of each individual feature or product that you're developing. We generally team with learning experts, learning people within the research community who know the pedagogical theory, the learning theory, as well as the learning analytics to help us. We're not by any means the experts, and we want to make sure that that the people who are developing with us really know what they're doing. So that means that we're building tool sets again to do that, to reduce risk by perturbing the data, creating synthetic data sets that are differentially private, and various other techniques. And then right up the other end, with Shreko and others, we're working on creating a sort of library, if you like, of standardized analytics that will work in a privacy-aware way, i.e. are optimized to work on these de-identified and somewhat perturbed data sets, because that's not always easy and it's not generic. There's no silver bullet that completely takes all the risk out, or a large amount of risk out that you can throw any analytics at. So it's a matter of matching techniques with the types of analytics and data that you want to get out the other end. And that's a fairly laborious process, but not rocket science. It's actually a fairly laborious process of running and matching and testing and getting the results and validating those, and working through the set so that we can have a sort of a library, if you like, a sort of Watson style library, not nearly as ambitious as that, of things that we know work within a reasonably acceptable sort of deviation on de-identified data. So that's kind of what we're working on, and it's sort of baby steps, but we're sort of, as I said, we're at the point now, a year and a half in, that we're using some of these technologies now ourselves internally, and Navitas is doing so as well. As I said, it's as much about raising consciousness across every person that consumes the information or the data as it is about creating more secure data sets, right, and analytics. Is that enough, or?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting, because I think it does tie very nicely to something that Simon was saying before. So I mean, I think from what you're saying there, it's very much about raising that awareness and educating the people who will be using this data. I mean, predominantly teaching staff, but others, around those ethical or privacy considerations. And I think Simon hit on a really nice point earlier. It's not just about raising the awareness of the privacy implications and the ethical implications of using the data, but also raising their educational knowledge and awareness so that they're able to use that data appropriately. So, yeah, sorry, Ruth.
That's absolutely right. And also, how and that also gets to I think Ben and Simon made the point of what are you actually going to be using this for? How are you going to be applying it? And that's really is the central question, right? So, and then what is the most ethical way of applying what you're learning? And what are you trying to achieve? Because if it's, at what point is it necessary to even do? Or is it a bell or a whistle, or is it something that's fundamentally going to help the student body? So they're all questions that also have to go into it, and you really need some skills and background more from the education side to understand that than the analytics or the AI side.
Actually, I'd like to bring Ben in at this point, if that's okay. And I do have to apologise, everyone. My
Yeah.
Collaborate Ultra is really not working, so I can't see anybody. I can't see the chat or anything. So I am going to throw to hopefully some of my colleagues to help me out with the chat in a moment. But I just wanted to continue this thought while it was in play. Because Ben, you mentioned before about students expecting action. And I think picking up on what Ruth was just saying there about, you know, working out why and how you're going to use particular things. What do you think the student's perspective is on that, in terms of, you know, if they see all this data being collected and they're kind of expecting some sort of intervention to be made? How do you think that the institutions can respond to that kind of expectation or need from the students?
I think there's kind of like two different answers based on if it was active or passive collection of data. So I think the passive collection, so, you know, getting learning traces from the LMS, the response of the student is as varied as their understanding and inbuilt paranoia about those kind of, you know, online systems. Like some are just like, oh yeah, have everything, you know, it's just going to be like a recommender algorithm on my Facebook feed, you know, I'll just get better courses offered to me. And others are just mortified, and there's everyone in between. I don't think there's enough understanding yet that we are getting this impetus that we should be doing something with that data in terms of improving the learning experience. I think as people in the field, we know, okay, we should be improving that. We should be using this to help improving the learning experience for our students. But I don't think that opportunity awareness has filtered down to students yet. And it'll be one of those things that as soon as, you know, a few institutions start really hitting the nail on the head there, then maybe that will sort of, the hands will go up and go, you know, what's my institution doing here? Yeah. I think it's a very different story than with the active collection of data, where you've got a survey, and in particular, like where people have sort of open text feedback to the institution, and students will write all kinds of things there. And you've got to be pretty careful, because it's, people like collecting the data, they like having it there, and it may, this sort of survey instrument may be created and then it just sits within the system. No one wants to stop it, but whether or not the resources are there to keep monitoring it and watching what students are saying, and well, is the thing that's monitoring this a human, or is it a, you know, an AI or a computational thing? Is it, has really big implications of whether we are meeting our duty of care of looking after our students. And I think that's a really, just from my little experience in sort of how these little trickles of data start coming in, they just get created and they stay around because no one wants to give up on them. You know, they think, oh yeah, we're getting this, this is good, but what are we going to do with it? Kind of ends up being this open, you know, shrugging question and looking around the room kind of situation.
No, I totally agree there. I think duty of care is something that it has been addressed to some extent in a lot of the discussion around ethics in the learning analytics space, but it's certainly, I think, something that I know a lot of people, I remember having a conversation many years ago, I hope she doesn't mind me quoting this, with Grace Lynch, who obviously is very active in the Society for Learning Analytics Research. And she basically sort of said, well, we've just got to wait for someone to sue someone and then we'll know what to do about duty of care, kind of thing. And to some extent, we don't want to wait until somebody sues somebody, but we do want to think about what, you know, if that data is there and if the data is being used in certain ways, what duty of care does that actually raise for the institution, and what would happen if something terrible went on and really the university just, the institution, depending on what kind of institution it is, just didn't take advantage of that. But at the same time, as you absolutely correctly say there, Ben, it's all about resourcing. What can we action and what can we respond to? Because that's as much of this conversation, I think, as anything.
Yeah, and
I just wanted to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Ben.
I was just saying, yeah, with the resourcing, because it's quite easy to create these data sets, and no one wants to let go of them. But it's really hard to monitor them. Yeah,
that's right.
I totally agree.
And I just want to link what you said there one more time, just to give Simon a chance to say something, and then I'll I hope Shreko or Hazel, you might be able to come through with some of the things that are coming through the chat. But Ben, you talked there, you know, again about that student perspective, and you know, and whether or not there is a kind of literacy around that data, I guess, to some extent, or an awareness and what we can do with that. But Simon, you were talking before about your experience in that sort of user, you know, human-computer interaction and that user experience. But where we talked about teaching staff needing to know more about education to be able to really understand and use the data in a meaningful way, how do you think we translate that for students? Because I kind of get the sense from a lot of the research that's happening in the learning analytics field at the moment that students also need to have a bit more awareness of what education is to be able to work effectively with learning analytics data. Do you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, so if I get what you're driving at here, Linda, it's about how do we understand how students make sense of automated feedback? Because that's essentially what a form. Learning analytics is either automated feedback or even higher stakes automated assessment. Now, most of us are not in the game of automated assessment because that's extraordinarily more challenging, as someone like Sandra Milligan has been, you know, explaining to the learning analytics field. If you really want to develop valid high stakes assessments, but never mind assessment, but formative feedback, which may be as simple as showing a dashboard to a student that says, you know, here's how much you're logging in, but or here's how your grade's going compared to the average of the cohort. But what's interesting and encouraging to me is that within the learning analytics field, that's now an explicit focus of research. What is the sense making that goes on when some displays come up in front of a student? And we already know that one dashboard size does not fit all, because if you're a high performing student, then you love looking at how you're doing compared to the cohort. And if you're a struggling student, then this machine is telling you over and over again how crap you are, right? Now, that's not motivating. That, you know, we're not in the game here of simply showing quotes facts. We're in the game of improving learning. And now, again, you know, as the research gets more interesting, it turns out that certain kinds of students do relish being challenged like that. Other kinds of students don't. So it all just gets more complex and interesting. But you know, when we start talking about feedback, okay, you know, the technology is now starting to go beyond simply passively showing students some charts and facts and figures, and actually trying to frame it more as feedback. Well, students have actually extremely impoverished concepts of what good feedback is or what they should do with it, as do many educators, we should also note, right? But you know, designing good feedback that's motivating and challenging is been well studied, and learning analytics needs to build on all that we know about how to give good feedback. And we know that educators don't give good feedback, and I'm not beating educators here because they're extremely busy and overstretched and stressed as well. This is an opportunity where machines do actually complement human capability, because machines can give instant feedback over and over and over again in a way that's just humanly impossible. So you know, something that we're looking at closely now is the great work that people like Dave Bowd and the whole crowd at Deakin Cradle have been doing on how you improve feedback literacy, both in terms of the educator and the learner. We know a hell of a lot about that now, and they're distilling that knowledge in very helpful ways. And we're now saying, well, how do we connect that to all the capability of giving automated feedback now? So we're not reinventing the wheel and doing stupid things that we could do more effectively.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, it does come back to that idea of beneficence and things that we pulled out of that paper earlier. So sort of trying to do the greater good. And I mean, obviously, you know, my background and interest in feedback, but that one size fits all really doesn't fly so well when you're trying to improve education, as you say. Now, I'm going to be probably the worst panel host in the world and have to hand over, or chair, I should say, and have to hand over to my colleagues because, as I said, I'm having very, very major technical issues here. But Shreko and Hazel, can I ask you to just moderate what's been coming through in the chat and maybe pose some of those questions to the panel members?
Yeah, I'm happy.
You're missing a whole lot of fun in the background, Linda.
Oh, no.
Hazel, go ahead, please.
Yeah, there's a question there from Stu, and thanks Stu as well for being one of the major contributors to the discussion that went on before this as well. But Stu's question's around informed consent and saying how many students agree to the collection of data without fully understanding what they're agreeing to, which I think is a very valid point. But something that raised for me as well is then what happens if a student says, no, I don't want you to use my data? How do institutions handle that? Because in some ways, for example, in the discussion forum, if you remove one student's comments from a discussion thread, you're distorting the data, but from an ethical point of view, that's what the students asked you to do. They haven't given their informed consent. So where's the balance here, and how often do we ask students for their informed consent? I can remember UTAS years ago set something up at the front of their LMS asking students for their informed consent, and they could say, this informed consent is for the duration of this course, this consent is for the duration of my time at UTAS, or I don't give informed consent. So I don't know who you want to answer some of that sort of conversation, Linda, but I'll put it back to all of the panel.
Yeah, I guess, Ben, I mean, you probably have dealt with this in the kind of work you do around your retention work. How do you deal with students' informed consent in that context?
Well, in terms of them understanding what's going on, yeah, it's really low. Like that's not really there at all. And I think this is such a sticky issue because there's a huge power imbalance in that if a student wants to study at your institution, they're usually signing, it's like a yes, no, signing up to sharing your data. There's not a tiered approach. There's not a, okay, yeah, I want to contribute my data in an anonymized fashion towards this, or I'm happy with this kind of level of detail, but no more. And that's not transparent and not well understood. And it's almost out of those 8 kind of things you've got in the paper, I would almost say that's the trickiest in terms of getting over the line. But I feel like the more we sort of help students understand what's going on, I think it will help them understand their learning process as well. Just being aware will hopefully improve that. But in terms of where it is at the moment, like we barely understand what's possible, let alone our students wandering into this environment.
And it does create an interesting situation where, you know, a student who really is in need of help opts out, and therefore the institution kind of loses that visibility to those needs. So again, what's the duty of care there, for example, from an ethical perspective?
Yeah, and if someone's really worried about their privacy, but they don't realize that, well, if I want to learn and I want to improve, I am going to have to share to some extent. And then there's the broader communities, like I need to be able to share my experiences as well so that everyone can learn better. So it's no good answers from me, I'm afraid.
Oh no, it's interesting. Ruth, was there something you wanted to add in there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very tricky one for us because we're a platform, a provider obviously is predominantly, and the students do give informed consent so far as they're told but it's really what they're being asked to do by the university, and there's very little they can not do and still do the course, right? So once they're on, you know, we can we give them the option to leave their mobile phone number if they want to get text messages or not. If they don't, and they're deleted at the end of the program. But very little else do we have. Can they actually choose not to put on the system? There's no workaround. There's no way they can sort of mail their work in or whatever. And also they don't really have a choice as to how long that data is kept. That's really determined by the institution as well. So I guess they're signing an overarching consent, as you said, Ben, when they join the institution. But what's interesting is, and what maybe they're not thinking about is how many places it ends up. It's not just their core couple of systems, the LMS that sits at the center of the university, but it's us, or, you know, and it's others outside of that setting. And you know, I'd be very surprised if they were aware of that, of the extent to which, you know, how far their data probably gets spread outside of the institution.
And it would be interesting to see, I mean, obviously we talk about this a lot, and it was referred to again in the paper about, you know, the Cambridge Analyticas and what Facebook does with data, and, you know, all of the different data breaches that, I mean, obviously I work for Swinburne, and there's been a data breach just this week. So, you know, there's a whole bunch of conversations going on outside of education as well, but I don't know whether students always translate that same kind of knowledge around what could happen into the education. Maybe they think it's perhaps a little safer, but and maybe that's reasonable, or maybe that's not, depending on what the institution does. This is really interesting. I do want to sort of head back to some of those other questions, assuming that there are other questions. So again, I'll ask Shreko and Hazel to jump in there with anything else that's come through the chat. And don't forget, we are sort of looking for something that you as an audience would like to take out of this, that we could perhaps build a workshop upon after this too. So if there are any suggestions or ideas, we'd be really keen to hear those as well. So Shreko, shall I throw to you?
Yeah, unless Hazel has a question ready, I picked up one of those from Suman. Do students have control or choice over their data that LMS or other technology generates? And I would probably say no, but I'll leave that to our panelists to answer. And what are the best ethical practices addressing the ethical conundrums, I can't say that word, surrounding the use of data? So can you, so basically it's about, do students have the control or choice at all at the first place over the data being generated by learning management systems?
I guess that does kind of overlap a little bit with that last question around their consent. But yeah, I don't know, Simon, do you have any additional perspectives on that particular conundrum, shall we call it?
Well, I mean, the reality is that when students join a university, I think they need to think of it as they're joining an academic community. They're expected to take and they're expected to give. It's not reasonable to say, I want to come to university and study, but you know, my ideas are mine. I'm not talking to other people. You know, so the scenario of erasing every contribution to a forum that a student has said they no longer wish to share isn't realistic from not just from a technical point of view. Obviously, you know, every organization these days is running on digital platforms, and we need them just to function as an organization. So actually, I don't think it's reasonable for students to opt out and say, right, I want to study at UTS, but I want to be off the grid. You know, sorry, we can't function like that. However, you know, there are some nuances here. For example, you know, none of the tools that we're developing at the moment are mandatory, but it could be that students could be given a level of control. So, for example, I was talking to some students about the use of OnTask for sending them automated feedback messages. You know, a very high-performing student said, I don't want those stupid messages. You know, I have very good study practices. I know how to get A's. I want to be able to turn that off. Well, should they be allowed to do that? Because the flip side is a student who is struggling, very poor self-regulation, very poor study skills, might also think that they don't need this either, right? Many students are not actually very effective learners. They don't know very much about pedagogy. They may know what they like, but they're also learners. And the educator's voice is another very important voice here. You know, I don't think the students get to rule here either. the educators may have a view that it's extremely important for you to hear these messages in this way at this time, and that's what you're paying for. You know, frankly, go and do a MOOC if you don't want any human intervention. So, you know, there's an interesting contract to negotiate here, right? You're
Absolutely.
paying me to basically bully you in a constructive, friendly way and get the most out of you, just like a fitness trainer. If you don't want a
Yeah,
fitness
we're gonna do
trainer,
that.
don't pay for one, you know?
Right.
You're still going to have to do the work.
That is so
Speaking,
true.
I think there is another comment from Stu that actually links nicely to this discussion and what Simon just said. And Stu also posed a comment on that. The student interpretation of data is also a tricky thing, right? So one student may interpret the same data completely differently than another. So their literacy around what data means and how to interpret it is super important too. So we don't want to reinforce negative self-perception or affect their sense of agency simply by showing them a visualization without teaching them what it means. So student literacy basically plays a huge role there as well. As in Simon said, basically, the low-performing student might also think, I don't need this, but then the reality might be totally different, right?
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. You know, it's not just about ethically using the data as in the teacher interpreting it, but, you know, giving the students the ability to interpret the data in the most effective way for their studies. It does become an ethical consideration to some extent. So yeah, no, that's really fantastic. I'm conscious that we're sort of in the home straight in terms of time. Oh, sorry, Hazel, did I just jump over the top of you?
My thought there as well is, whose role is that? Because the academics are probably saying, A, I need to be taught it first as well, but B, I don't have time in my very busy courses and curriculum to be teaching students this data literacy, how to read the visualizations type thing. So universities need to think about who and how that information, that literacy, those skills are taught to both the staff and the students.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Well, I mean, we've talked about a lot of stuff in this session, and I'm conscious that we're 2 minutes before the hour. So I think we probably should wrap it up from a formal perspective. But I'm certainly happy, and I'm sure some of my co-organisers of the SIG are happy to stick around for a few more minutes if people want to keep chatting. But just to round things off, I'd really like to thank our panel members today. So Ruth Marshall, Ben Hicks, and Simon Buckingham-Shum for giving up your time this afternoon, and but for sharing your perspectives on this area. It's one of those things where we always have these conversations and we sort of start into something and you think, wow, this could go on for hours, but we never quite get the hours to do it. But it's been really interesting to hear the different perspectives that the three of you have, certainly because of the different roles that you have within your own organisations or institutions. So thank you so much for your contribution. I'd also like to thank Shreko and Hazel. So the three of us are the organisers of the ASCILITE Learning Analytics Special Interest Group. So we have been doing a number of different things over the last few years to try and get people or continue the conversation, shall we say, around learning analytics. And as we said before, ethics is that one thing that keeps bubbling up, and people seem to have a lot of interest in that. So I think there's been a few kind of key themes coming out of some of the conversations that we've had today. And I'll certainly work with Shreko and Hazel to work out where next in this little series. So we've called the general series Digging Deeper into the Ethical Use of Learning Analytics. And we do want to sort of really try and surface up, pardon the pun, I guess, to some of those issues that would be really helpful to all the different sort of stakeholders that are part of this conversation. We're really aware that ASCILITE as a community has a lot of different members in a lot of different kind of roles, and we do want to be able to give you some thought-provoking activities and opportunities to discuss these different elements from the different perspectives that you may have. So it's right on the hour, so I'll stop talking for now. I've probably talked enough. But again, thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you very much for all of you for attending, and certainly for those of you who also contributed through the chat. And I do apologise very much about my technical issues, but hopefully it wasn't too terrible. But again, thank you so much, everyone, and thank you for the time.
Thanks very much.
Thanks, Linda.
All right.
Thanks, Shreko.
No
Everyone.
problem. No problem.
Thanks,
And if
everyone.
anybody else.
Thank you.
If anyone else in the audience wants to throw on their mic and keep chatting, please feel free. We'll stick around for a bit, but if you need to rush off, that's absolutely fine too.
I'm being kicked out, so I have to go. But thank you all very much.
Oh, not a problem.
Thanks a lot, Jude.
Thank you so much, Ruth.
Thank you. Yeah,
Thanks.
got to run as well.
Thanks,
but
Ruth.
thanks very much for having me on.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Simon.
yeah.
Great as always.